Recording, if you would, please. Thank you. Welcome everybody on Zoom, and welcome everybody here in the room. There's our man. All right. Well, let's start out first just by asking if you have any questions. And let me just read through the text one more time. And then if you have any questions about the video or the text itself, I'd be very happy to hear them. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength in his arm, and has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham, and to his descendants forever." And Mary remained with her for about 3 months and then returned to her home. All right. Lydia, do you need a handout? I've got one right. All right. Okay. Questions? You have questions about the text itself or the video that I made about it? All right, hang on, less. It's always less. It's always less. Let's start with Jerry, and then we'll come back to Janet. Yes, sir.
It hits me, having read up this point about this simple young girl, Mary, out there in the countryside someplace. This is pretty magnificent poetry, whatever. I don't expect that out of a country girl who was caught by surprise someplace in the hills.
Yeah, that's great. So you contrast a little bit the way Mary is described as a virgin in the hill country, right? She doesn't live in the hill country, but she's gone to the hill country where Elizabeth is. And then suddenly she breaks out in this magnificent poetic discourse, which could mean, that she was a Loretta Lynn, a diamond in a rough. They really had this great poetic ability, or a Dolly Parton. The thing that surprised me the most when I went to Belfast was at Queen's University in Belfast. They have an entire, it's a large room, and it's a museum dedicated to Dolly Parton. Because they identify with her. She's from this kind of groundbreaking, rooted people, without a lot of pretense, and she's able to speak truth and all of that. I mean, they love Dolly Parton, and they had a whole museum set up for her. It blew my mind. Yeah, so you got this very unexpected, lovely, and powerful discourse taking place from someone from whom you may not expect.
What about David?
I'm sorry?
What about David?
What about David? He's been dead a lot of years now before this story.
Country boy tending his father's flocks.
Okay. All right. That's what you mean. Yeah. So David's another example of somebody that, the whole story of David being revealed as the chosen one really plays on that, right? Because he's got all these brothers, and it's like, surely this has got to be it. This man's tall, dark, and handsome. And God said, nope, that's not it. And you keep going, and finally you run out of brothers. And they asked, don't you have any other sons? Because Samuel knew one of Jesse's sons should be the king. And, he's the runt of the litter. He's out watching the sheep. We didn't even bother bringing him in. And when they do bring him in, God said, this is what. So you're right. This whole process is very similar to that one.
And all the Psalms.
Turned out, and all the Psalms that are attributed to David are very poetic and very powerful, for sure. So that's an interesting thing to see. where this poetic gift comes from. And it may be from Mary, it may be from the community that told Mary's story, it may be from Luke. But at least as far as the story goes, it's from Mary. So that's something really admirable. Janet, did you have a question?
Is the mighty one a common reference to both?
Don't really see it. It, like I tried to say in the video, it's just kind of a participle and for doing, one who does, one who performs. And so it's kind of hard to see where the title, Mighty One with capital letters, might be coming from. I think that's more on the translator than on the text itself. But I do think what follows is after she says the Mighty One, then she starts to describe the strong arm and scattering the proud, which is no small thing. So I think that the judgment call that the translators make to take that participle and make it the Mighty One is reliant to some degree on what she says later. And at that point, I think it becomes really helpful. Yeah, but no, it's not a working title so far as I know. Beryl, thank you for coming. Would you introduce us to your friend? or at least that guy sitting next to you.
We just met casually. He expressed an interest in the Bible study, Mr. Morris, and so yeah, I think I'll introduce you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, great to have you here.
Welcome.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got the impression when you came in, Beryl went way back, and so I waited till she got here to have you introduced. You're welcome. It's good to have you here. Yeah. Any other questions, comments about either the text or the video about the text? Jerome, can we shut these doors? Thank you. Yes.
Well, in your presentation, you talked about this as the great reversal.
Yeah.
I think two comments. One, it could be called, since it's a Magnificat, a song, prophetic reprisal.
Okay.
And two, I think the whole thing turns on 51. That's when he starts doing all these.
Start scattering it, bringing down. Yeah. Okay. So what Les's comment is, it could be called the Great Reversal. It could be Great Reprisal from all the Psalms that speak powerfully in the very poetic voice. And he says it all seems to turn on verse 51, when God has shown strength in God's arm and scattered the proud. All right, thank you. Let's move then to that phrase, the Great Reversal. And you know that I had a chance to see the video. I started with a story about a friend of mine who I just invited to read the Magnificat and tell me if God's work in the world can really be reduced to simple personal salvation. And after reading the Magnificat, she said yes. And Deborah, I want you to repeat what you said when you came in here that not everybody was here to hear.
I thought it was willful ignorance that she couldn't see it.
Okay, so Deborah thought it was willful ignorance that she couldn't see that there's more to it than just personal transformation in the work of Christ. Anybody else? I tried to make the case that this is much more than all about whether I get to go to heaven when I die. And I'm not dismissing that as an important question. It's an existential question that we all carry with us at all times. But for the journey of life that we have here, I feel like this text speaks to a lot more than that. And I'm wondering what your responses are.
Well, I checked this out a little bit on the internet just to see what other voices were saying.
Great.
And I was very surprised to find out that Guatemala, Argentina, and India, there was a period of time when they would not allow this Magnificat to be included in
There.
Okay, let me say that again for the folks online in case they couldn't hear your voice from there. Bobby looked on the internet about the impact of the Magnificat and said for a time it was Guatemala, India, and Nicaragua. Argentina would not allow a public reading of the Magnificat. Considered subversive, inflammatory, and maybe that's why they're in the hill country, where you can get away with that stuff. Yeah, wow. I remember some friends in El Salvador saying there were times that the whole Gospel of Luke was suspect because it's so radical in its outlook that the public authorities did not want people reading. Yeah, wow. Anybody else? Your response to seeing the Magnificat as a great reversal? Yes, ma'am.
Just kind of a thought about the friend, maybe not the right answer about the topic, but just that if it's such a core belief for your friend too, like reading it maybe isn't willful ignorance, but just their faith depends on it being about them personally. And you could say like, well, Mary's one person, I'm one person. So I could see choosing to stick to that narrative. Like I think the reversal is clear here, and I think it starts earlier too, because you have the, my soul magnifies the Lord, spirit rejoices. You have this like high language, and I'm lowly. Like the reversal starts right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So it's embedded in there, but I understand the need to cling to something that's a piece of identity.
Right. So this, and I'm rewording just for the sake of the whole, because Mary's an individual, as profound as these words are, and perhaps as earth-shattering as they are, they're coming from an individual who's talking about her experience. And sometimes I think that's a great point, Jen. Sometimes our tendency to make the experience of salvation personal comes from either insecurity or a real existential threat that we feel that we need that assurance. And so it does become the primary lens, maybe not in a willful way, maybe, but maybe not. And maybe it's driven something a little harder to put. Yeah, wow, that's, you can always leave it to Jen to find sympathy for somebody that the rest of us are ready to go. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that she would have known about the prophecies, maybe in the Old Testament, or can we even conjecture about that?
Okay, so the question is, would Mary have known about prophecies and statements made in the Old Testament? And I think the answer is yes. She makes a clear reference to Abraham, to the promises that were made to Abraham and Abraham's descendants. I think as a good Jewish gal, she's been grounded in that
She would
story.
have heard them rather than read them, probably, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. Would she have been able to read? Boy, I don't know, but I guess I doubt it.
I feel
Yeah.
like not, and it doesn't
Yeah.
come from anything,
But
just that I feel.
Let's hold that for a minute, because when my grandmother died, I got her Bible, and she had told me about it years ago. It's a great little story of how she got it. But in the middle was the family lineage stuff. She couldn't spell at all. I couldn't spell her kid's name, or especially the people that her kids married. It was all very phonetic. And it was the first time I realized that probably these are my paternal grandparents. I don't think any of my grandparents graduated from high school. And I'm relatively sure that neither of my grandfathers got past like third grade because they had to start working, or anyway. So they might have been functionally illiterate or borderline, but my grandpa read the Bible. He had read it and heard it read so many times that he could open it anywhere. He could start talking about something, he would open right up to it and start reading it. And that was always curious to me. I think I know they had newspaper. I just don't know how. I don't know that they were as literate as many of us might take for granted, that you can take a fairly sophisticated off the shelf and read it and at least know what it's what the words say, whether you can figure out what the author is trying to talk about or not. And I've always thought that when it comes to thinking about the first century and literacy, it's very obvious that the whole context is different from ours, because you have this whole class of scribes. And the reason they're important is they are very literate. They can write, they do your writing for you, and you need them, you depend on them to petition or something like that. But I wonder if for a long time, maybe I had too strong a divide between literacy and illiteracy, if there's not something in between where you kind of learn to read certain things and you can read them with one eye because you heard them. I'm thinking those little bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, 12-year-old Jews who are reading this text that they've been practicing with their rabbi over and over again, Hebrew, reading in Hebrew. If you gave them some modern Hebrew law, they might look at it and go, I don't know what that says, right? So, and the reason I'm going on and on about this, I wonder where Jesus fits into that. So he got up and he found the place in the scroll where it's written in the prophet Isaiah, and he read it. But reading like my grandfather read, where, I got this. This is my favorite part. I know this front and back. I memorized this. When he cites, when the New Testament cites the Testament, a lot of times they get it wrong. I mean, and they don't seem terribly worried about that. So I just wonder if the whole idea of literacy is just different for us than it was for them. So she was certainly articulate in the tradition. And maybe that was more important than literacy, because they were more oral than visual. And the oral tradition is where you learn a lot of things. So you don't have to be able to read written things. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
I can also accept the notion that she maybe in that moment may actually have been inspired.
Yeah, sure.
She had the history, she knew the
Right.
history, but in that moment, something
Right.
really clicked for her, and she was able to.
Right. And we don't want to omit that, the possibility that in that moment she's simply inspired, whether she read this or can't read, heard it, or whatever, she got this going on. Yeah, I want to leave that possibility open and come back to it. Yes, Jerry.
To get back to that time and the political situation she was in, they're still under the boot of Rome, and it would be the same for her wherever she came, wherever she did this. Yet she's saying that the strong arm of the Lord, and he scattered the proud, he's brought down the powerful, he's fed the hungry. Well, most people are poor and hungry, I would imagine, at that time.
Right.
So if you're listening at that time, when was the victory that God had for them in the past? And why should you grab that and think we're going to have a victory today? And just how political is this? We read it for a pretty story, and isn't it beautiful, whatever. But if you dig at that, that's pretty darn revolutionary.
Yeah. So a couple points being made back here. I want to make sure everybody hears it. One is that, first of all, this is really revolutionary talk. As much as we like, that's why I shared the story about Kierkegaard a couple of weeks ago, going into the church and hearing this soprano sing the Magnificat. And everybody thought, isn't that pretty? And he looked around thinking, we're done for. We are doomed. Look at this place. We're the rich, right? So yes, it's almost too pretty, if I can say that with deepest humility, knowing I'm probably out of my mind. It's so pretty, so poetic, that we almost miss the prophetic power that's in it. But then you also mentioned, Jerry, something about the tenses. And, you know, when did Mary see all of this having been or being accomplished? So if you're all okay with it, let's move down to part of our handout. And I just tried to list there the different tenses at work. I want to read through those, and then I want to step back and tell you why I care. Okay. Mary starts out with the present tense, my soul magnifies the Lord, and then she slips into the past tense, my spirit rejoiced. Then she will speak of the future tense, all generations will call me blessed. So we got all the tenses here, folks. The past tense, God looked on the lowliness of God's servant. God did great things for me. God has shown strength. I think that's imperfect, which is the form of the past tense, but not the simple past tense. God scattered the proud. That's an aorist, simple past tense. God has brought down the powerful, lifted up the lowly. God has filled and sent away. God helped and remembered his mercy. The promise God made, of course, that was in the past to Abraham. So we have a lot of past tense going on here, some present tense, and a little future tense. Let me start by just asking you, what in the world? What's going on here? A lot of modern translations are going to smooth it out and just make them all present or future. Not a lot of past tense showing up. Some. What do you make of that? What do you make of Mary using the past tense when, as Jerry said a moment ago, she and her people are still evidently living under the boot of the Roman Empire? When did this liberation happen? Has it happened? Yes, Les.
Return from Babylon.
Yeah. All right. Do you think she's all right? The return from Babylon, but do you think she's talking about that?
Well, you're asking whether the past has any relevance to what she's saying.
Right.
And I'm saying in the common ethos, the return from Babylon would be a very signatory event in their history of God reversing and doing something for his people.
Okay. So one historic event would have been when God brought them back from Babylon, which was precipitated by Cyrus, the Persian general, defeating Babylon. Another possibility, I mean, if you want to go deeper, would be the language of the rescue from Egypt, right? The liberation from there, horse and rider thrown into the sea.
Part of the Red Sea was no small thing.
No, none of that was a small thing. But I guess I'm asking you at this point, is she using the past tense to refer to things that happened in the past?
Well, I think
She's getting ready to have a baby.
that the ethos of the time would make this a possibility.
Okay.
God has,
I'm not even talking about
God has,
but I think I'm going to agree in the sense of something very similar might be.
well, God has done things for us, excuse me, in the past. God is faithful. I think God will.
Okay.
It's kind of you take care of the things of God, God takes care of you.
Okay. All right. That's a little more than you were saying earlier, but yeah. So in some sense, maybe we can hear this as Mary singing, like the song, our God, oh God, our God of ages past, our hope for years to come.
Mhm.
That if you believe that God's steadfast love endures forever, then you can point to a past event, and that has relevance for your present moment. That's the ethos you're talking about. Okay. Carol.
I just wonder, Mark, if, is there anything in the text that would indicate that, say from maybe about verse 50 on, there's a change in voice or in author or anything? When I read this, the first few verses, I can sort of feel, if you make it feel like Mary, but then it becomes, to me, almost liturgical
Oh, yeah.
in
interesting. Yeah.
its voice. And if I think of what little we know about who she is, it's kind of, it seems sort of, how should I say it? Beyond what a simple
All right.
young
Yeah.
woman might be saying.
Right. So you have a couple of things going on there. One is you're making a point very similar to what Jerry had said earlier. It's like she kind of,
Yeah.
she's speaking beyond the expectations we would have for
Right.
someone like her. To which Janice responded, maybe she's just filled with the Holy Spirit and inspired, right? Inspired to speak beyond perhaps what we expect. But your other point I thought was really interesting, that there almost seems to be a voice change between verse 49 and 50.
Yeah.
Verse 49, she says, the powerful one, the great one, the holy one, mighty one, did great things in me. So that's very personal, and holy is his name. And then in verse 50, I like how you put that, Beryl, that it's almost like she starts speaking liturgically. You know, this is what she learned to say by going to Shabbat services over the years or something like that, right? Yeah, so let's remember something. Remember when we were reading the story of John the Baptist's birth, and there were some words in there that were unique to that part of Luke's story that we don't really see elsewhere in Luke's gospel. And one thing I offered you as a possibility, I'm repeating this over and over again without any illusion that just because I keep saying it, it must be right. But remember, Luke started out by saying, many people are telling this story. So I've investigated all of these stories, even talking to firsthand witnesses in order to give you this. And I want to take that very, very literal, that Luke is doing his homework, investigating, talking to the right people. Now, if that's the case, then I think it's very possible that the stories about John the Baptizer, which Luke is weaving together with stories about the birth of Jesus, that's his work as an editor. But I think the original source of those John the Baptizer stories may be those Baptist followers who may well live still out in the wilderness and so forth. Because John the Baptist had a big following. And they would be the ones who would cultivate this birth story, because that legitimizes the fact that they are followers of John the Baptizer. And that's where stories would be cultivated. And Luke is honoring that. He doesn't just say, oh, you guys are following John, you should be following Jesus. He sees John as a legit forerunner. And he's on. And I think the way that he tells that story reflects the way it was shaped there. Not necessarily what Elizabeth said or Zechariah said. That's part of it. But also it's been through the oral tradition in that community. And Luke is hearing it. And now Luke is representing it. And likewise, there's a community that's been cultivating the story of Mary. And it could be the community that adds all the liturgical stuff, or at least the liturgical cadence to it. Whereas this happened, I don't have any problem saying this happened. Mary was incredibly inspired, and as such was speaking tremendous prophetic truth for a young gal, possibly illiterate. And here she is just saying these marvelous things. But when we hear that, we are hearing Mary's voice, yes. We're also hearing the voices of those who heard this story and told this story and then heard it and told them and magnified, if I may, the story. And then Luke heard it from them and tried to put it in with integrity, right? That's what oral tradition does. Look, that's the beauty of it. We weren't there. We're not there. This doesn't give us a view of necessarily what we would have seen if we'd been peeking through the window. What we're hearing is this great admixture of faithful believers over the years for whom this story has meant everything. And they've told it. They've told it in a way that could potentially get them thrown into prison or killed, right? This is incendiary stuff. And they're telling this story. And that's what I love is when you and I read that, we're joining that great tradition. When we study that, when we opine about it, when we go home and tell somebody what our Bible said, we're joining that tradition, which takes this story up, imbibes in it. And even though we have a written tradition,
off topic, sort of quite off topic, but I just wonder how she is named.
yeah. So let me just say for the television audience, it sounds like for a moment there, the recording was stopped and then restarted. So I hope you are watching the second recording. I don't know how that works on the magical world of Zoom. Yeah, so I don't know. So look, I don't doubt that just like there's a community that's particularly devoted to John the Baptizer's representation of the reign of God, still God's people. There's probably some Mariologists, right? Some folks very devoted to Mary, and keeping that alive, like we see today. There are some folks for whom Mary is such a central figure in their piety, and there are some folks for whom they could be like Mark and not mention Mary at all, and so forth. So, I suppose they're all kinds. My only point being that, yes, we're hearing kind of liturgical cadences. Maybe that was part of what Mary was inspired and reached up to do in that moment. Maybe that's what happens as people tell the story, and Luke hears it, and then Luke puts it in his best form. Yes, sir.
Mary's hearkening back strikes me as being similar to many of our contemporaries, hearkening back to George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. We don't know the details, but we know them and we know what they did.
Right, that's a great point. So just like we harken back to the founding fathers, if we're telling the story of the USA, and we're doing a show Hamilton or something like that, right? We reach back and we rely on some things everybody already knows about them, right? You mentioned George Washington. You don't have to say, oh, by the way, he was the very first president of the United States. You don't do that, right? These are familiar landmarks that speak of tradition. They're familiar to us because we share that tradition. If you're speaking to someone in a very distant country, there's a good chance they have no idea who you're talking about, right? And then you introduce before you refer. So that's one thing to look for in the Gospels is they refer to something without introducing it, just refer to it, assuming that their audience knows it. Then they're assuming a certain kind of shared tradition already. Between them and their initial audience, not necessarily me or you, but between them and their initial audience. Wow, this is taking us somewhere. Let me share one thing real quickly before I forget it. So this past week, I got an email from a former seminary classmate who is watching our videos and discussions. So thank you. Kind of surprised and honored. There were a couple of things she wanted to share. One was she wanted to be here when we had that discussion about Elizabeth going into hiding because we didn't know why, right? And we speculated some reason, but we didn't know why. And remember, I called that a narrative gap based on somebody else's rap, that you get this piece of information, but without an obvious cause or reason. And her point was just hold the gap. Maybe that's Elizabeth's business and not yours. Maybe, maybe she had her reasons. And maybe the fact that nobody knows her reasons is part of the reason. People don't always have to explain themselves to the likes of me, right? I thought it was a great point, right? So one thing perhaps with the narrative gap is when we notice that, let me and I encourage you to add option C, which is just hold the gap. Maybe that's not my place to be. It was been a strange thing for me over the years to realize not every scripture is written for me. I can act like they all are, but they're not. The Magnificat would be a good example. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing that she said was she felt like when I was associating Elizabeth with her late in life pregnancy, having been called barren all of her life. I was representing her as an echo of Sarah, who had been barren all of her life and then had a late in life promised pregnancy and so forth. And she felt like by doing that, I was diminishing. I hope I'm representing her well. I was diminishing Elizabeth's unique story. Now, let go. I think there are two levels of things going on here. On the one hand, there's Elizabeth the person, right? And what we know about Elizabeth through the scriptures means that Elizabeth had a very significant and unique story and would have experienced it uniquely. Nobody, gets a cancer diagnosis and says, this puts me in the league with those famous people who have gotten a diagnosis of cancer over the years, right? We don't do that, right? We don't immediately situate ourselves within the tradition with certain things because they impact us powerfully. Now, if we step back and say, well, the treatment has been developed because of all of these people who had this disease and all of these attempts, then maybe we find ourselves in the tradition. But the impact, there's a level at which it's a personal, unique story. And yes, I want to honor that Elizabeth has a personal, unique story that I'm not trying to dismiss. And I hope I haven't come across that way, but perhaps I have. But here's where I'm going to push back a little bit. We don't have Elizabeth's story directly. We have it vis-a-vis Luke's gospel. And Luke is, in my mind, very intentionally writing echoes of previous stories in the gospel. And you see it particularly here in the Magnificat, where Mary is going to make direct reference to Abraham. Abraham and his descendants, right? The promised Abraham and his descendants. This is Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. This is Genesis chapter 15, when that promise is repeated. This is Genesis chapter 18, where it's repeated the third time. This is Genesis 17, where Sarah had a hard time believing it. This is Genesis 18 where Abraham laughed, right? So Mary, at least as Luke is representing it here, is making a direct allusion. This is not an echo. This is an allusion, a direct reference to Abraham and the generations. That's the Abraham to you and your seed. The question becomes, which one, right? Is it Hagar's son Ishmael? Is it Sarah's son, the unlikely one, Isaac? The whole question of fertility and barrenness becomes an issue for Sarah. It becomes an issue for Rebecca. It becomes an issue for Rachel, and 3 generations of people struggling with the same thing. And it's all about the seed and the promise. And so, in my mind, Luke is deliberately echoing these stories. And I don't think it's a dismissal of Elizabeth's uniqueness at all to say that Luke is deliberately echoing these stories and inviting us to see it with terms of Sarah's experience. Because that's what enables us to see Jesus and John the Baptizer as promised children in light of the promise to Abraham. So I get that. I think what we have to do is walk and chew gum at the same time, right? On the one hand, appreciate Elizabeth's uniqueness as a person, but at the same time, we're not talking to Elizabeth. We're reading something written by Luke. And Luke, I think that at least that's why I pay attention to the grammar, to the echoes, to the names and all of that stuff, is because what we have is a story mediated through things like that. So when we look at these texts, I've just got a mouthful, and I've got one more mouthful to say, and then I swear I will stop. But when we look at these texts, it reminds me of my favorite gospel story. And it's been a while for me to develop the point where I can say this is my favorite gospel story. It's not even in Luke, it's in Mark. And it's in chapter 12. And it's where the Sadducees come up to Jesus with a trick question. You've heard me mention this before because it's my favorite gospel story. And they pose the question to Jesus because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. And they propose this scenario, which actually you can find in one of the intertestamental books, about a woman who marries a man and he dies before they have children. And so according to the law of levirate marriage, the next brother marries her and he dies before they have children. And so on through 7 brothers. They all die. And then finally she dies. All right.
Why would you marry her?
You have to. And you have to marry her. And why wasn't she charged with murder? I don't know. So anyway, that's actually a story from the intertestamental literature. And they pose it as a way of showing how ridiculous resurrection is. They're like, if they resurrect, whose wife is she? She can't be everybody's wife. These are people who didn't mind saying a man could have several wives. But anyway, Jesus answers. First of all, he gives it the best comeback ever that I still want to use one day, but I just don't have the confidence. He starts by saying, "Is this not why you are wrong?" I just love that question. Is this not why you are wrong? You neither understand the scriptures nor the power in them. Think about that. So you got the scripture, the written text, the script, and there's the power in the scripture. Mm-hmm. And then to make the case, Jesus goes back to an old story in Exodus chapter 3 and talks about tenses. Jesus talking about tenses. Bless his heart, right? That God said to Moses, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Now they're long dead. They are long dead before Moses comes along. They've been dead over 400 years. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jesus says, am. means that they're not dead. That insofar as God lives, they live. Because God is the God of the living and not of the dead. And Jesus, it's just, nobody, you'll read the book of Exodus a million times and that will never hit you, right? And say, oh, wow, they must still be alive. Nobody does that but Jesus, right? And Jesus says, look at the tense, which is why I think sometimes we have to pay attention to these tenses and think about what they're telling us. Mary is making no distinction. I think this is what you were saying earlier, Les. No distinction between God's activities in the past, God's activities in the present, God's activities in the future. Because God is beyond time. That's our limitation. And she can speak of God's past as a way of saying how God's going to act now and how God will act in the future. Because in God, those tenses, every tense is an eternal present tense. That's what Paul Tillich called the eternal now with God. And I feel like Mary's leaning into that insight, whether she understands it or is inspired or that's the way the community shaped it. That's what I'm making tenses is that, yeah, tenses are our business. God isn't confined by them. It's part of our finitude. Kind of an interesting thing of being a creature in time. Yes, ma'am.
Is that the story where he's being asked, what is the greatest law or something like that? Or is it
There
a
are a
different
string
story?
of challenges.
Oh,
Yeah,
What
and
was
that
it?
one comes from someone else.
what
But
was
yeah.
the citation again?
But I want to think it's Mark chapter 12.
Okay.
It is Mark
Um,
12, yeah. I just had it up. I'll find it later.
Yeah. Verse 34, something like that. Yes, ma'am.
I always have felt that we refer to Mary as being the innocent and the sweet, and we have no way of knowing really, but I've always felt that she probably was someone who was learned in her history. In other words, this was bestowed on her because she knew from the beginning, just like we teach our kids, we try to way back from the beginning of Genesis when we're reading in Sunday school and all.
Right.
I always felt that she probably was good because she knew her life and the beginning. I don't know that.
Right. Right.
That made me feel like you always wonder why there's a reason that she was chosen.
Yeah.
And we may never know that, but
Right.
the fact that she says all this means she was learned.
Yeah.
in
So
history.
yeah. So you have a couple points there. One is that Mary seems to be speaking out of a very learned position, which I think among a people whose identity is threatened, like the people of Israel would be under the Roman Empire. Because with the empire, you go along to get along. And they're angling to keep their uniqueness. Circumcision was a big deal because that's their unique identity. And we'll talk about that next week when John gets circumcised. And there are these identifications in the story out of which we come gives us our identity. So yes, I would think as a good Jewish girl, I don't know that Mary would be terribly unique in this respect. As a good Jewish girl, she is aware of this tradition because they cultivated that very deliberately. Your other point was maybe Mary was chosen because of her grasp of that tradition, and that may be, but we have no idea.
No, we don't.
I find solace in thinking there's no particular on her part. God just chooses whom God will.
That could be.
That
too.
gives me a fighting chance. So yeah, but I don't know. That we all wonder. Yes, sir.
Change the field a little bit.
All right.
I think of Homer, and when you read that, he's retelling stories that have floated around the Mediterranean, but you know it's Homer, iambic pentameter, nobody else was speaking particularly that way. are there other places in Luke where he speaks like this? So you would say, this is Luke making this pretty, prettying it up. I think not. And then makes me wonder, this also is a story that was going around. So he isn't just, being a reporter. This is a story. How was this used? How would we think this was used by the early church, that it came in a unique fashion to Luke and he put it down in unique fashion? Was this a chant? Was this a song?
Oh,
Was this,
yeah.
a marching
Right.
song? Was this, how was it used by the church before it got written down?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Jerry's noticing, first of all, the poetic nature of it, and asking if we have similar moments like that throughout Luke's gospel. That was your kind of first question. And secondly, how do we imagine that this particular poetic moment was used and understood by the early church
Pre-Luke.
pre-Luke, during the oral tradition? Okay, so let me say this. You can answer your first question very easily.
Read the book.
Seriously? No. Well, not even the book. If you open your Bible to the Magnificat, most of them, I wouldn't say every one, but most of them has it written poetic, has it represented visually, in short paragraphs, right?
Yeah.
All right, and then you can just kind of leaf through the pages and see where that happens again. I'm guessing it may happen in chapter 4, when Jesus reads from the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the good news to the poor." I imagine it happens in chapter 6, where you have the Sermon on the Plain. "Blessed are you who are poor," right? And that's as far as I can go
And
right now.
Jeremiah's prophecy that's coming up soon. Is
Oh,
written that way
Oh,
too.
yeah, right. So Zechariah is going to,
That's Jeremiah.
yeah. Zechariah later in this, in this chapter, Simeon's words in chapter 2, the angel's words in chapter 2. Yeah. So Luke kind of loves this stuff and seems really good at it, which is part of why we say he's such an excellent writer. The other side of that is the Magnificat is typically considered the first of either 3 or 4 canticles in Luke's story. Did I mention this in the video? Okay, yeah, that's right, because we're going to follow them for our Advent thing. And the reason we call them canticles, we don't know if the angels sang. There's never really that verb in the Bible regarding the angels. They were glorifying God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest." But it's just much more fun to imagine them singing it, particularly to the tune of Messiah or something. But yeah, it's at least poetic, if it's not musical. And I wonder how much of this might be, because chanting was part of this tradition. And things are much more memorable, I think, through the chanting tradition than just reading, particularly the way a lot of us read out loud and just kind of mumble through it. And I think Jen might have.
No, it was just an English teacher note that Shakespeare wrote Iambic pentameter, a heroic verse title, dactylic hexameter. So
I was just showing off.
Homer wrote dactylic hexameter.
Yes.
Yeah, that's not giving Shakespeare. The other thing, here's the other great thing about Homer, okay? And here's how you might think of, well, I don't know if that would be helpful. So Homer tells these stories, and almost all of the definitions that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle used in doing their philosophy are dependent on the Homeric epics for meaning. Alistair McIntyre, very clear, I think makes a very impressive point about this, that systematic philosophy is grounded in narrative philosophy, just like systematic theology is grounded in narrative theology. And what does that mean? It means that these early communities telling these stories, it was a story before Paul wrote letters. It wasn't a written gospel. That comes after Paul's letters, but it was a story. And when Paul meets Ananias, he hears the story. And it's powerful. I think our native tongue story, not systematic didactic thought, which I think is great, very powerful. Yes, ma'am.
When you ask the question, is this how you have seen the birth of Jesus? Are you implying that what she is saying is a template for his earthly mission? I'm not quite sure
Yeah.
what you mean by question.
Well, okay, let me explain my question, and then open up the floor for it. This is all part of the narrative. We don't read it on Christmas Eve because we don't have time. We have to sing a lot of good songs. It's part of the birth narrative. And we really focus on the first 7 verses of Luke chapter 2. And then we might focus on 8 through 20, the story of the shepherds. So maybe we'll get 20 verses on Christmas Eve, and we call that the Christmas. This is part of it. And I think I'm just going to tell you my underhanded suspicion behind this question. I think we have domesticated the birth story and made it just a homey little warm tale that's told best in front of a fire, with the kids in their night clothes, ready to go to bed, and the little cups empty now of hot chocolate, and we tell this story, and they brush their teeth and go to bed. And I think we've domesticated it to make it beautiful. There's part of that I think is great. It's a beautiful story, and domesticating something like that and beautifying it like that, maybe what Luke was doing by poeticizing this. Maybe that's just what we do. But I think we detach it from the Magnificat a little too easily. The birth of the Christ, Mary's word.
That was for the other Mark Davis, sorry.
The birth of Christ in Mary's words changes the world. Are we aware of that on Christmas? I think to some extent we are, because we're giving up our whole life just to pause and celebrate this birth. But by changing the world, do we see the great reversal? Or do we think, oh, now God is with us, everything's better? I'm not sure. Okay, what were you saying over there?
I was sending a message to Sue Ann, clicked on the wrong Mark Davis,
Oh,
just for an attendance thing. So
Okay.
Something popped up.
okay, all right. Last comment, because it's a little past time.
Jerry's question, how is this used? I think so many of these stories are kind of, where did we come from? Why? And this is telling where we came from and why.
Yeah, so a story about origins, typically called an etiological story. And sometimes it's not always where did we come from, where does practice come from, why do we study on Sundays, why do we do this? And there's a story that explains the origin of it. And so in some, maybe this is, it would help us to look at this as an etiological story. Why do we worship the Christ? Why do we call Jesus the Christ? Why do we celebrate Jesus' birthday? Not just sit around saying great moral things to each other. Why do we center so much on Jesus? That's a really good and present, pertinent question. that we don't have time to answer right now. So we are going to just take that question in our hearts, and we're gonna stop the recording, and we'll see each other next week.